Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Scott Stedman Podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about interim work and interim pastors. And if you are unfamiliar with that term, we will be discussing what that means later on in our episode. But joining me today is my co-host, Micah Current. Micah, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm ready for spring. I don't know about you, but I'm tired of this cold weather. We've been pretty spoiled in Ohio with the whole late blooming of winter, and then when winter hits, it's like, man, it's 10 degrees outside. It's 5 degrees outside. The wind chill's negative 15. I'm a southern boy and I love warm weather, so I'm ready for spring. How about you?
Now, have you had any issues with frozen toilets this year?
No, thank you, Jesus. That was last year. We had that bad storm, and we have 3 bathrooms, and only one of our bathrooms worked. And you would have thought we had first world problems because we only have one bathroom. I mean, it was no, seriously, like it's amazing that you don't think about those things until only one, like, because we have we have 3 toilets and 2 showers, and only one shower and one toilet worked in the entire house. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and it took about a week for that to thaw out. So just grateful that that hasn't happened this year.
Awesome. Awesome. And also joining me today is Dr. Jeanette Flynn. Dr. Jeanette, how are you doing today? Are you a doctor? I just made that up. I think you are.
Not earned. So I don't.
Do you have an honorary doctorate?
I do.
So you're
do.
Reverend
Wonderful.
Dr. Jeanette. There you go.
Yeah,
There you
I
go.
don't need that title. There are too many people I respect who have earned the title. I did not.
Got it.
Wonderful. Good, good,
I
good.
guess I'm gonna have to earn the doctorate then to feel better about that then, because I've always joked, I'm like, I'd rather just somebody like give me an honorary one and just be really good at something. And
Like when Charles Schultz got his from Anderson.
That's
I don't even know who that
Dr.
is.
Charles Schultz. Charles Schultz, the Peanuts guy who did the Peanuts cartoons.
Okay, never mind. I was thinking of somebody else. I was thinking something related to the Gaithers. It had nothing to do with that. It was completely
honorary doctorates are given either because you're old or you've given. I shouldn't probably. I'm probably make people mad. You're either old, you give a lot of money, or you've done some, something that is significant in the eyes of people around you. So I don't use the title.
What was the criteria again?
Either you're old,
Okay.
and you've been around a long time, or you've given a lot of money, that works too, or you have done some significant, like Charles Schultz, he's famous. So
Okay.
if I give you an honorary doctorate, then my name gets attached to you. And so
Well, I was going to say Taylor Swift got an honorary doctorate from New York University like 2 years ago, but
my perfect illustration.
she's a billionaire and she's idolized by so many. So
Well, there you have it, friends. That's what if you're thinking about getting an honorary doctorate, you just got to be old.
That's
really
right.
And rich.
Or
And
rich.
famous.
Or rich. Yeah. Yeah. So
Old,
please
rich,
send
and
all
famous.
comments to Scott.
Who is not old, rich, or famous.
There you go.
But is earning a doctorate, but through
That's
actual education and taking of classes. And
I have great respect for that.
Yeah, awesome. All right, but we're going to be talking about interim work. But before that, story's gone wild. Micah, do you have one for us?
I do, and I think I texted you over the weekend, and I was like, man, I started like a running list because I've been talking about starting a list of all these crazy ministry experiences over the years. And since we're going to be talking about interim work today, I'm going to share about a story where I worked as an interim worship pastor a couple of years ago at a Baptist church in our community. And I've had stomach issues my entire life, and you pair that with some anxiety, it's just a recipe for disaster. And I don't care if you're the senior pastor, I don't care if you're the worship pastor, I don't care if you're the senior adult pastor, youth pastor, etc. There are nerves and there's pressure that goes along with getting up on that platform in that sacred space. And so the way that this church was set up is like, if you're looking at the sanctuary from like the pew or the seats, you have the platform where the musicians are and the pastor preaches and everything. And then there's two doors on each side of the platform that go back, and then you can go underneath the sanctuary across, because there's a hallway that goes back up the stairs. And so I had been at this church for 2-3 months. I was there probably 8 months, I think, total, as their interim. And man, my stomach was just bothering me because I just have, a bad stomach. And so I would always make a point to hurry up and go to the bathroom before service starts, because I'm just nervous and, just, you gotta go. And so like, I would also make a pit stop on the way, back to my seat after worship is over. And so like, I'm drinking a ton of water because I have to sing. And so one Sunday after service, pastor pulls me aside and he's like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, why?" He's like, "You just seem to disappear after worship, and it's more appropriate that you're in here." Granted, this guy's a Southern Baptist preacher and he preaches probably an hour anyway. So like, I'm not going to miss much. Right. And I'm thinking this in my brain, but like, he said that somebody was saying that like they noticed that I was coming in later after worship, and it was like they didn't understand why. And I'm like, "Well, if you really want to know, I have stomach issues." And I told him that, and he was like, "Oh, well, we'll try to hurry up." And I'm like, "Well, I'll try to do what I can, because I'll do what my stomach can tell me to do," because like he was just super critical of the fact that I had to go to the bathroom. And it wasn't like I was missing anything, right? Because this hour sermon was, in fact, my wife always made the joke when we were there, the man just doesn't know how to land the jet, because he just, he'd be 20 minutes into a 45-minute sermon and he was still on point one, and it's so like, I think it's a Baptist thing, salvation and all those fun things, which goes along with preaching. But yeah, he was, somebody was not happy that I was using the bathroom, apparently. So that's my story's gone wild, Scott. I mean, would you rather me just like go in the seat, or I don't know. Like,
yeah, that's funny.
I mean, I just get nervous, right? Like, I think it's just human
Yeah.
nature to get nervous about these kind of things. And
Yeah.
like, apparently I wasn't getting back to my seat fast enough after I led worship and had a powerful time of prayer and worship. I don't know.
Hurry up. I got to preach for 2 hours. Hurry up. You're taking up too much time.
Yes,
Goodness.
You're taking too much of my time. But like, there's 200 people in the sanctuary. I'm like, what's going on here? Like, why are we worried about this? So anyway, Scott, do you have a story?
Yeah. So my story has to do with it had to do with a church I was interiming at, and the church I was interiming at was very small, barely had money in the bank. It was one of those things where they're trying to look for someone. The last pastor was a bivocational pastor for 5 years and had his own like AM radio, Christian radio station. So I'm there and I'm kind of helping them find their, helping them keep things afloat, but also they had no clue like what they needed to do. This is, I don't think they even used Ministry Connector before or anything like that, which,
what's Ministry Connector?
What's Ministry Connector? Exactly. So,
rest in peace.
Needless to say, I had to deal with an issue because we'd have like every couple of weeks we'd have a meeting. I had to deal with an issue because there'd be a guy at the church who gave the most money to the church, and he felt like it was his right because he gave X amount of money that he could turn up the heat in the building when the building was not being used. So, the church usually would have everything down at like 60, 65 degrees when it's not being used. And then someone would get there in the morning before church starts, bump up the heat and get it warmed up by the time service started. So since he was the guy who also kind of helped clean the church, he'd get in there, he'd turn up the temperature to like 78 degrees and then do his cleaning work and would just leave it and not turn it. And then when they kept telling him about it, so he felt like, well, I give the most money at this church, so I can leave the heat on. So I have to go deal with that situation. And I just thought it was probably one of the first times, because again, like I worked as an intern at my home church. I think this is the first time where I'm just like, man,
78's really hot. right?
78's really
I mean,
hot. A, it's hot. But B, I mean, I don't know what this guy was doing. Like, was he coming in wearing like shorts and a tank top, cleaning the church? Like, thought it was beach day. But it was just like, it's like it was the first time I'm like, man, there's some weird things that happen in these churches because. So I think that was like my very first ever Stories Gone Wild since I've been a pastor, was that where they had to bring a guy into the makeshift office in the back of the sanctuary and just say, hey, you can't be leaving the heat on that high, and had to talk to him about it. And he's like, but I clean it. It's always cold. I'm like, that's fine. I get that. But at the same time, like, if you do realize that even though you're given the most money, you're still not able to you're still running a deficit. Even having a bivocational pastor, you're running a little bit of a deficit. So the more you can kind of keep that deficit small or break even is going to be good for the continuation of the church. Oh, okay. Like, so, basic common sense that I had to teach this guy. But yeah, that was it. So that's my story. What about you, Jeanette? I mean, I'm sure you have tons of stories about interim work and crazy things, but what do you have?
Well, you're right. Anytime you're doing an interim, there are surprises, that you're just going, wait, what? How did that? So at an interim that I did, when they contacted me, the senior pastor had left abruptly. And so they called and said, hey, could you come and do 3 months interim work? There's a larger staff. They had about 5 or 6 people, well, 7 people on staff. And can you just come give the staff a break? And we think the executive pastor is going to become the new senior pastor. So can you come and do that? Sure, I can do that. And so went and started the interim ministry there, and gave the executive pastor, why don't you take 30 days, go rest, because you're going to pick this up and run with it. You go rest. It was about, I think, maybe 2-3 weeks into his 30 days. And he called and said, we need to talk. I'm not going to come back. I'm going to take another position. It's like, oh, and then within the next few months, 4 more staff members dropped resignations, and then I helped one leave. And so within my first 3 months, we had 5 resignations, and my interim there went from 3 months to 15 months. So that went a little wild for me. It was like, oh my goodness.
Wow.
Yeah, it just kept going. Wait a minute. It was
I was going to say it's common in some church spaces that, like, when a senior pastor leaves, a lot of stuff will go. But then
usually not when they go. Usually it's when the new guy. So I was expecting the new guy to take all the hits.
Mm-hmm. But apparently you did.
Apparently. So, which is fine. It was all fine. It all worked out. I think God was in it. But talking about stories gone wild, it was like I was holding on for dear life, because it was not at all what was anticipated. So, and interim work is like that, by the way. You really, yeah. They give you a job description, but it's just a piece of paper.
You're saying all I have to do to get a doctorate is.
Goodness. So as we move to the topic of interim and being an interim pastor, for those who are listening who may not necessarily understand that term or may not have to deal with interims, like, what is an interim pastor, Jeanette?
Sure. An interim pastor, and it can be in any position, by the way. It's not always just the senior role that we often think about. That's largely where it is. But sometimes we have interim youth pastors or interim worship leaders. And the word interim means, the in-between, for a season. And so the interim pastor is there to help the congregation in the time of transition, moving from the leader who has just left, whatever role just left, and you assist them in continuing to remain strong or grow stronger until they're prepared to call the next leader who will be there long term. So you're in transition. The word interim pastor has it's now almost equally referred to as transitional pastor for that reason alone, because you're helping them in a time of transition.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So Micah, when you think about your interim term, did that fit that definition that Jeanette gave us about what an interim pastor is?
Yeah, I believe so. Something I may add, if I may, is that like I think, at least in my experience in both interim roles that I worked in, the pastor asked me if I was interested in the position, if that makes sense. So like one church I was at, it was a Southern Baptist church in the community I live in. They needed an interim worship pastor. I was there for 8 months. They asked me when I started if I was interested in this long term. And then by the end, like during the time, I actually sat down with their elders and I talked with them about it. I was working, full time somewhere else. And so it was like, I just didn't feel like that was going to be a good fit, for me to stay long term. We were going to pray about it and talk about it. But like at the time, it was a part time position. So I'm like, I've been there where I've been bivocational and it was super taxing on me, emotionally and physically and mentally. And, um, yeah, so like I think another part of that too is that like sometimes if you're doing a great job as the interim, don't be surprised if they offer you the job or try to get you to apply for the job. But I've also seen it too, like in spaces that I've worked where I'm on staff at a church and the lead pastor leaves, and then we have internal candidates apply, and then they don't get it for whatever reason, and then they leave. And it's like,
Yeah.
or there's like stipulations in place where, they open up, the portal, so to speak, about, folks applying for this position, and staff aren't allowed to apply for it. They're like disqualified for whatever reason because they're already serving in a role. I've seen that too. So there's just a number of ways that I think of interim work, in respect to like, okay, if you're truly going in there and you're just going to serve as the interim and provide what Jeanette said, a stability, then great. But if you have other motives or the church has other motives, it's like, I think you need to be very careful too, like in respect to candidates and people and the way that you're looking at this job description and what you want people to do and what you're, don't in there as an interim, because you and the three of us around this virtual table know that sometimes it takes forever. Jeanette just said she was at a church for 18 months, trying to, wait for the next lead pastor to come. And, we all know that it can take forever. And sometimes we should talk about that too. But like, the idea that churches often can use interims is kind of like a stall tactic to actually hire somebody else. It's like, you know, I I've worked at churches where they hire somebody in a month, and I've worked at churches where they've not had a pastor for 3 years. So, just a number of things to consider. And aside from Jeanette's definition, which I think was accurate, what do you think? What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I would say that's accurate too. It's been very interesting because living in two different states and looking at their interim process, it's very how do I put it? It's very interesting. Like in Ohio Ministries, like I feel like they had a list of interims and it was broken down by districts. So if you're a church in Northeast Ohio, you can look for Northeast Ohio interims and you're good. Virginia didn't really have anything based because they only had didn't really have regions. And before I became the pastor of the church that I was at in Virginia, the interim there was there for 2.5 years. And he drove probably a good 2.5 hours just to get to church. and then would drive 2.5 hours back home. And that was quite a haul to do that for almost 2.5 years, which when I got there, there's a bad snowstorm and there was this plans to kind of do this, passing of the torch, as you will. And with the winter storm, he wasn't able to come up. So basically it was like we canceled church. I get there and we canceled church for the next 2 Sundays because of weather. And then I started, and that was it. Like there was no ceremony, no nothing. It's like, okay, you're the pastor, here you go. So yeah, like I would say, when I think about my experience as interiming, it was very, very different because again, they needed a pastor. At one time they asked me, since I was looking for a church at that time, they're asking me if I would be interested in it. And I kind of dabbled in the idea, but there definitely was some signs that kind of made me think, I don't think this is going to work. And one of them was because they just didn't really were good stewards of the property and the stuff that they had. And what I mean by that is they went and showed me the parsonage. And I remember they opened up the door and apparently they rented it out, but they never returned the keys. And I remember opened up the door and the first thing you saw was these big muddy footprints throughout the whole entire house. And these people are like, what? Like, how did this happen? I'm like, well, somebody probably has a key and walked in here. So they called the former pastor saying, hey, were you in here or something? And he's like, no, I haven't been there. So obviously someone didn't do their due diligence to get the key when they were renting it out. So I tried to talk with them and tried to help them as best as I can. And eventually I got them, here's how you can try to find a pastor. So I sent their stuff to help them know who to send their stuff to with Ohio Ministries. And it also got their stuff set up for Ministry Connector. And I do remember the one time, and Micah, you mentioned earlier, like, I didn't really have much power or influence or say on some changes, because you're just kind of there to kind of help maintain. I was in a particular spot where I did have some influence because there was one pastor that they were looking at that looked really good. It was a pastor from Oklahoma, wife, 3 kids. And they put what they wanted. They said we can only pay you like $12,000 a year. It's a bivocational job. And yet this person was demanding that they get paid $40,000 to come down there and be their pastor. And they're asking me, and they're at the point where they're saying, well, should we do it? And I'm thinking, and I'm looking at their budget, I'm going, are you going to take out a loan? Or are you going to mortgage the church to get this guy here? And they're considering it. And I'm thinking, listen, I said, listen, this is what you decided you're going to do. And if someone is trying, and I mean, I know you guys want a pastor, but is it worth, because there's no guarantee that this pastor is going to revitalize your church. There's no guarantee. And yeah, you might think like, oh, he has 3 kids and that will bring kids to the church. And oh, they're young, so that's going to bring young people to the church. Like, it's that mentality like, oh, this would be good. But it's like, yeah, but how long are you going to have this person here before you have to say, sorry, we can't pay you anymore because we don't have money? So I told them, I know this person's interested and they say they're interested, but there's no way you're going to go mortgage a church and bankrupt yourselves trying to get somebody over here. So I said, absolutely not. Do not hire this person. And they listened to me. But then luckily they found another person who was Northeast Ohio, agreed to their terms, was a plumber by trade. Originally was from the Barberton Church of God. And and he was there and he was a nice guy and he was there pretty much until the church closed. But it was interesting because even when we would drive through that area to get to my parents' house when I was pastoring up in Youngstown, like I would see signs like, hey, after school program here at this church. So they were he was actually doing a great job with that church. And eventually, money and time just kind of ran out on him and they had to close their doors. So, but I thought that was strange. Like, oh, hey, I'll come be your pastor if you give me $40,000. Like, we're only offering $12,000. Like, but I just thought that was crazy too.
I mean, I think you need to like, and this is a completely separate conversation, but like when you're applying for jobs, like I think that, there's this, kind of, it, for example, in higher education, they post salaries for jobs when you're posting, you're applying for them. So like that, to me, you would think that that'd be like one of the first questions you ask, like how much money is this church willing to pay me, or how much this position rather is willing to pay me to come be your senior pastor. And like, I think two things. One, I think a lot of pastors are in denial because they think they can come in to be the catalyst and make the churches grow. And there's no guarantee, right? It takes an act of God and the Holy Spirit to make that flourish and grow. On the other side, it's like if we don't have the money to pay you, then why would you even apply or consider it?
Yeah.
And I shared on another episode of this podcast, but my brother and sister-in-law go to a church up in Northeast Ohio, and it's a Church of God, and their senior pastor died a couple of years ago, and they have hired an interim, and they've had an interim for almost 2 years, and it's like the church has 20 people. They don't have any debt, but they can't pay nobody because they don't have the number of people. They have barely enough money to keep the lights on. So it's like, how are you going to hire a pastor to even pay them the minimum of like, I don't even know what the minimum like salary range is for a pastor, these days, but like, 40 grand doesn't seem like enough, but like if you can't pay to keep the lights on and the water and the pipes from busting and the heat and all that stuff, then there ain't no way you're going to be able to pay a senior pastor. So, and I know that Jeanette, you've been working in an interim position recently. Are you still there at that the one you're at now?
Yeah, yeah, I am in an interim position right now.
Well, you said something similar about I'm not trying to name names or churches or anything like that. I'm just being careful, but like I'm just saying that like you said you experienced some similar situations where
Yes.
they're on their last. We talk about life cycles, right? We talked about that in leadership focus, but like
Yep.
churches are in their last phase of the life cycle of the church, and they want to bring a new pastor in, but they can't because they can't afford it.
That's right. Yeah. In fact, as I was listening, I was thinking the same thing, Micah, that sometimes churches get an interim, quote unquote, interim pastor because they're unwilling to confront the real issue, which is we're at the end of our life cycle and probably we need to close or we need to merge or we need, we got to do something different. So the way it's avoidance. I avoid having that discussion. So I get an interim who drives in and preaches on Sundays or maybe makes a visit or two during the week. That is not, an authentic interim. So I think when we're talking about interim pastorates or interim positions even, it's important to really identify there are different types of interims. Some of them are just fill in the gap. Some of them are there because the church is wanting to avoid the real issues. And then there are some interim pastorates that are authentically, the purpose is to authentically prepare the church for a new life cycle. So yeah, and really interim ministry is still developing. It's still being formulated, and not that we haven't been doing it for a long time, but we didn't have these kind of conversations where we talked about what type is, what is real here. And, I think we're coming to a stage where you're going to have different conversations about interim ministry because we've learned a lot over the last 3 decades.
Can I add to the avoidance conversation?
Yeah.
Something else I've noticed over the years in ministry is that churches will set the bar so high for their job description of a senior pastor. In this illustration, a lead pastor, senior pastor, that they want that person to have a PhD, they want to have a terminal degree, they want, so many years of experience, and they want them to be, like I said earlier, the catalyst to grow the church. They almost, by adding that word avoidance to the conversation, they almost make it so difficult to even obtain the position that they just stall and they avoid actually hiring somebody as a result. I don't know if
Sure.
you've seen that too, but like I think Scott was saying that there's a church that we all know mutually that like they wanted their new lead pastor to have a PhD or be in the process of a PhD, and it's like not everybody feels like, some of the best preachers I know have never been to seminary and don't have a degree in ministry, like.
Mm-hmm.
But yet they set the bar so high that they avoid, hiring a new pastor. And then, in another situation, like, I'll use this illustration, right? Church has a pastor leaves, they hire an interim, for example, was Dr. Claude Robold. Everybody loved Claude. Claude is an amazing human, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
They go to hire a new pastor. How is anybody going to compare to how great Claude was? Because Claude is just such a stable, loving, caring, phenomenal preacher, person, loving man of God. I could add the verbs, the whatever at the end of his name, and I have a dear friend who was at a church. He goes to a church where Claude was the interim for a while, and it's like, man, I miss Claude. Claude was so good. And it's like, well, how do you get over that? Because Claude, is retired from full-time ministry and he has no desire to be a senior pastor anymore.
Yeah.
But then that's a whole nother conversation of putting your faith and your stock in a person rather than God and letting God move the church forward instead of just putting it into one. I'm going down a huge rabbit hole, but like I think that it's like, well, I just think it's important to realize that like you can't just put all your stock in the person. And like I see that being an issue too, where you hire an interim and they're phenomenal, but they don't have any desire to be there long term. And then when you hire a new person, it's like, well, they're not as good as the other person. They weren't as good as the interim. Here's what the interim did. Like, and you get that too, even if like you hire a new pastor and there's not an interim. So
Yeah.
Scott, I didn't know where you wanted to go with the conversation, but I was just thinking about that as well.
Well, yeah, and I think that's kind of the we talked about life cycles in churches. I know we've talked about that in a previous episode with you and Jeanette. And I think that's always kind of been the big issue with with interim pastoring is that, like Micah, you said, well, I couldn't make any decisions, where I was in a spot where I had to literally tell someone, please don't bankrupt your church because you're trying to bring somebody in for an amount of money that you did not post, that you said you were willing to pay. Right. And I think that's always so I'm kind of curious, do you think that the reason why some of these churches, when they have their interims and then they finally get the lead pastor, do you think that there is something within that process that can kind of make that transition smooth so that people can kind of realize like, okay, this is the person we hired. This is the person that we voted in. This is the person that's going to be our next lead pastor or next worship pastor. And yet you still have people going, oh, well, man, I miss Pastor Scott, or I miss Pastor Steve, or I miss Pastor Claude. Like, is there a way where, like, how do most people navigate a good transition between an interim and then their new pastor and make that smooth so you don't have kind of these like factions or these split groups? Or is there anything anyone can do to kind of make that process, that transition a little smoother?
Yeah, one of my favorite words that Jeanette uses is recommendations. And Jeanette is phenomenal at making recommendations. And I've known her for years. And that's one of my favorite things that she does. It's like, she's always thinking, she's always forward thinking and like offering recommendations and almost having like a succession plan. And I know, Jeanette, you're writing stuff and you're, I don't know if you're writing a book or you're just writing something out just in reference to interim work, but if you could speak on that. I thought it might have been a church my dad pastored, but like you offered recommendations, and that word just stuck out to me because that's a Jeanette word, recommendations.
I don't know that I can own the word, but I do love making recommendations, partly because I believe it not only allows but requires people to participate in choosing and in putting forth effort. I think there's we've got so many subtopics going today in what we're talking about. We could have about 10 more of these, because here's a subtopic for you, Scott. We hire pastors and want them to do all the work. If the church doesn't grow, we blame the pastor. If the church does grow, it's got to be the pastor. I mean, so here's another subtopic for you. But I like recommendations, because it says back to the church, I can help you think, I can help you pray, I can even help you in leadership, but you have a responsibility. And here's some recommendations that you need to take a look at, think about, pray about, and you're probably going to have to put some hard work and dollars into making it happen in order for this to be successful on the other side. An interim ministry does not guarantee success on the other side. And we sometimes, I think, we assume, we'll get this interim and the next person coming in will just pick up and run from there. Not true. Not true.
Yeah. Well, as far as, sub conversations or going all over the place, like, I think that's the nature and the messiness of interim work. Is that you really don't know what you're getting into when you walk in and say, "Hey, I'm willing to be the interim pastor." And like you said, Jeanette, you were at that church for 3 months. You're like, "I'll give you 3 months." And 18 months later, 5 resignations later, bringing a new pastor in later, like.
Yes, that's exactly right. Which is another reason that, as we are talking about this whole field, if whatever side of the table you're on this morning, where you're listening to this or, thinking about this topic, I cannot tell you how important it is to have clear expectations and clear understandings and clear guidelines, boundaries, and too many times churches and pastors will just simply sign on the dotted, like, yeah, I'll come over and be the interim. And nobody has anything in writing. Nobody knows what's being expected. So colliding expectations happen. There's a disappointment. Well, I thought the interim was gonna, boy, that's Scott. When he was here, he didn't do this. Or, the illustration you use, Micah, well, when Claude was here, boy, he did it. Now we're all compared to Claude. It's like, no, if there are clear, outlined, written, clarified understandings from the interim's perspective, from the church's perspective, and I maintain even from the state's perspective, those 3 entities ought to all speak into what are the expectations for this season and this interim and this church. What's the expectations? When you get there, you have the best chance of really beginning to help a church move to the next level of readiness. Otherwise, they're filling the gap.
Ask another question that may press some buttons.
Yeah.
Scott and I talked, I think it was last week. Maybe it wasn't last week. It was a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about not necessarily transitions, but like when there's a moral failure in a church and the pastor leaves, or the church says you're leaving, there's really a lack of conversation between the church and the state. And based on how the bylaws and whatever church X is, there's not a lot of conversations between the state. Do you see that a lot with interim work too, where there's just not a lot of communication between the state and the church? And it's like, well, what does the state do in respect to that conversation?
Yeah, in fact, I think too many times it's gotten a little bit better, but too many times states, if they'll offer a church, a half a dozen names or maybe 2 or 3 names, whatever, they'll offer the church some names, and then it's like, shoes, because, in the Church of God, the biggest God in the Church of God is autonomy. So we have to let everybody, run their own ship here. And so as a result, there's no, what do I want to say? There's no wisdom being given that helps. I wish more states were equipped and ready to be able to actually guide the conversation between the church and the interim. And, I just think it's a great opportunity for a state to become more deeply engaged in the future health and growth of a congregation is in those moments of transition. And too many times we're too worried that we're overstep. We shouldn't say anything. And it's like, no, it's the perfect moment of transition. Let's put everybody at the table and talk about how to make this a moment of growth, a moment of health, a moment that changes the rest of the story.
God, I thought she was going to say the D word.
Oh no.
Denomination. She was going to say denomination.
I avoid that.
Anyway, yeah, but I mean, I think you bring up a very interesting point, because anytime when I've sat in any state general assemblies or any type of meetings, it seems like when you talk about church health, it's always about church planning, church planning, church planning.
Yes.
And I feel like what you're saying is, we can kind of do a great job if we can really take the resources to have someone be kind of like the mediator, say, between a church that their pastor has moved on. We're now going to put an interim in here and kind of lay down those expectations, kind of understand the wants and desires, and really do that, because I think that's really going to help people, to say, okay, there is some life in this church that if we have the right wisdom and the right tools, we can really see what God can really do. And then, or you can have to have those difficult conversations where, it's time to put this bad thing to rest. And let's kind of talk about merging. Let's talk about, and I feel like no one wants to have those conversations because I think they're difficult conversations. And I think, like you said, people, Church of God, it's all about autonomy. But when you get to a church of 20 people and they're all aging, and you're about to get to this point, like and sometimes there's a lot of times where some of these churches, like especially the church I interim, they really had no clue how to do a lot of things, how to make decisions, how to be a board, how to do certain things. So a lot of times they were kind of always moving by they're just going from one fire to the next. And it's like, if you're constantly doing that, how can you even plan for the future or make good plans to kind of be successful in the future and really have a plan for growth and vision and anything if you're just constantly moving from one fire to the next?
Exactly. And I think there's not a better moment. In fact, I tried to advocate for this at the national level, and I didn't win that battle, but I tried to advocate that when anyone wanted to, you use the term ministry connector, which it has been buried. So we give thanks for that. So we have a new system up that's now. And so I tried to advocate that we would, before you could even get on there would be requirements for a church and for a pastor, and that a church would have to take 2 courses, just 2 easy courses that the care group would offer on financial health and stability, and one on church health that we could provide. And anyway, I think, Scott, you're identifying, I know we're supposed to be talking about interim ministry, but we've got to really address this whole issue of what happens when a church is in transition. What really, and for too long of a time, it's just been, well, we just help them get the next person. No. It's the perfect moment to do what you just talked about, Scott, to help them really evaluate, identify, explore, maybe get some educate, maybe help them come to a reality check. Whether that reality check is whether they're even viable or not as a congregation, but certainly a reality check about what it takes to pay a pastor these days a living wage.
Yeah. And even outside of that, I think just the idea of you have a church meet with an interim, and the interim's kind of your vehicle of your catalyst for transitions between the last permanent pastor and a new permanent pastor. And I feel like a lot of times, at least in my experiences in the last couple churches I've been a part of, I feel like once I got to the church to be the lead pastor, there wasn't really much of a good, like, passing the torch, as you will, from the interim to the next pastor. It was almost like, if this pastor was here interiming, leading these people and talking with these people and helping these people for the last months or even years, then I would think that the information they would have would be relevant to the new pastor coming on. Okay, how do I take the ball and continue to do some of the tweaks and the changes and some of the things within this? It's almost like, okay, it's almost like an interim's a holding place. It's almost like a nail kind of holding the tarp down so it doesn't blow away until we can put a new permanent fixture in there to actually hold the sails while you're sailing. It's almost like the interim's the duct tape, and then like the real pastor's like the actual bolt. And it's like, well, it shouldn't be that way, because a lot of times I feel like even at the end, or I go and meet the interim years later and we're talking about stuff, and I may mention, something about, oh yeah, there's kind of this person, or maybe there's this issue going on. And they'll say like, oh, is it this person or is it this issue? And you go, oh yeah. And they're like, yeah. And then they walk away, and it's like, well, that would have been helpful if you would have told me about that. So then that could have been like one of the first things that I started like really investigating. And okay, we need to clean this issue or this thing up. It's like you have all this wisdom, and then you go where when I interimed in Wyndham, when the new pastor that they were going to hire came in, like I was still there, and they go, hey, is it okay if we have this person come speak before we go? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. So I met with him before he came to speak. We talked about things. He asked me questions about things that I've experienced. I said, hey, here's some of the things you need to know. Here's kind of the culture. Here's kind of, some of the things that can help you. And again, I'm not telling them you should do this, you should do that. I'm just saying, here's what I've experienced. Here's what I know. Use this information to how you can lead and go from there. And I think in some ways, a church that I really didn't think was going to last for another year ended up lasting for at least a good 5 years after I left, before they finally closed their doors. And I think a lot of that had to do with the new pastor, because he was very passionate and good in what he was doing. But at the same time, I think just me kind of giving them a little bit of insight. Because I think there's sometimes where people will tell an interim something because they know, well, he's not permanent, so we can tell the interim whatever we want about this church and all the problems and stuff we have. But when we have the person who's coming in, we're going to kind of keep our cards close to the chest, because we don't want to put them on the table and they go, oh, we scared off, and now the pastor's gone, because they're like, I don't want to deal with this mess, and they run. So you kind of don't really see the full hand, where an interim sometimes has more privy to see the full hand of cards. Or at least that's how it was in my experience of interiming.
Yeah. No, I think you're right about that. The interim will indeed be exposed to some truths, some revelations that are so
harsh realities.
Some harsh realities. You're right. Harsh realities.
Well, I'll say too that like in higher ed, and my wife will just love me for this because she's a big proponent of this. We write things down.
Mm-hmm.
Like we do these things called SOPs, standard operating procedure documents of step-by-step analysis of everything that we do. So that like um we also call them like the oh crap book or something like that, because like if something happened to me today after work, right, or if I quit my job or something happened or I got terminal illness or whatever, right, and I pass away or somebody passes away, there's something written down. So
Yep,
if somebody comes into
exactly.
that role, that they know what's going on. And I think it should be the same for interims. Like, you know, a lot of times you come in as the interim, you assess what's going on, you see where things are, you try to bring stability to the situation, you get things on a straight path from where they were, because the church obviously is in disarray after their pastor leaves. And so like we get to the point where there's some stability and then you bring another pastor in. But like I would be writing stuff down as I go, just so that like when the pastor walks in, it's no different than like the president, right? The president of the United States. I think there's like this running thing where like the president will leave a letter for the next person after their term is up, and they'll leave it in
Mhm.
the desk, and the next president will walk in and say, hey, this is what I did, here's what you can expect,
Mhm.
good luck,
Yeah.
whatever, right? Something as small as that. And I think that goes a long way, because like it or not, as an interim, whether you're there 3 months or 16 months, you're going to have an impact on that church and the ministry of that church. And so like it's, you may not have the title lead pastor, but you're going to be in that holding space for a different reason other than being in the holding space, if that makes sense. So,
Yep.
Jeanette, I want you to talk quickly. I know that we've spent about an hour on this call, but you would talk to me a couple weeks ago about writing stuff about interim work. Like, could you talk about that? What you're writing and
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. So I've put together it's just really would be really more of a small booklet or just
okay,
a kind of a guide outline. Was asked to do that for the regional pastors across the nation in the Church of God. And so I've just tried to put together something as I think about their role, and many of them, are their assignment is unrealistic to begin with. I mean, here oversee 300 churches and do it in 20 hours a week or something. So their assignments are unrealistic. So I tried to put together something that I thought could be helpful to how do you select an interim pastor? How do you walk with that interim pastor? So like, for instance, one of the recommendations that I made about, for a state with the interim pastor is you need to have at least a 30-minute conversation monthly, maybe a 60-minute conversation. You should be asking that interim, what are you discovering? What are the strengths? What are the, what are you seeing that we could do, so that there's kind of a collaboration, the state gets to know them better. The outline or the writing that I did for them includes, how to minister to the church and how to help them. It also includes a section on how to prepare the church. We were talking about, here's Claude. And I've run into it a time or two where, I tend to be a fairly strong personality. And so it can be a bit of a transition when the next person comes in who may be a little lower key, has a different style, whatever. So how do you, as an interim, how do you ensure a healthy transition so that you set the next person up, for the best entry and the best win possible? So it's just, it's brief, it's short, it's to the point. I tended to do more bullet. Hey, here's some recommendations. Be happy to make it available to you guys. If anybody on the podcast says, yeah, I'd really like to take a look at that, I'm happy to send it to you, Scott. And if you want to share it, just send me all the royalties. That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll That's great. Yeah, we'll definitely have it. And for those of you who are listening, if this is something that is interesting to you, you can message me through our website, thescottstedman.com. You can send us a comment both on our Facebook page or even on YouTube, and we will make sure we will get that information to you if you are interested in taking a look at it. But Jeanette, again, it's always a pleasure to have you on our show and to hear your wisdom. So we're very excited about seeing these resources and seeing what great things this has to offer for not only the Church of God, but even all the different denominations we have here in our world.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. It's always a joy to be with you.
Yep. Thank you. And friends, thank you so much for listening. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll be back on with another episode here on the Scott Stedman Podcast. Take care.